products based on comics, like Little Orphan Annie. You can buy your Little Orphan Annie mug, or if you're into Dick Tracy, maybe you prefer your Dick Tracy gun, because this is America after all. And so anyway, as I said before, nothing succeeds like success, and the comic strips eventually over the first few decades of the 20th century became very firmly established as an acceptable part of everyday culture, everyday mass culture. But in part because they were controlled by newspaper editors who did control the content and made sure that the comic strips were appropriate for what was considered to be a general audience of readers.
Donc je pense que vous avez compris, en fait, ce qui vous a montré, c'est le succès grandissant de la bande dessinée dans la première moitié du XXe siècle, et le fait que les artistes les plus célèbres gagnent énormément d'argent avec leur bande dessinée, y compris pendant la dépression, parce que la seule chose que les gens peuvent encore s'acheter finalement comme loisir à cette époque sont des journaux qui sont très bon marché, donc tout ça continue à se vendre même dans cette période-là, avec en plus tout un phénomène de merchandising qu'on connaît bien, l'apparition de toutes sortes de produits dérivés qui vont rapporter énormément d'argent. Donc on est là devant un art alors populaire de masse, on n'avait jamais fait ça à ce point, d'une certaine manière, mais ça ne veut pas dire pour autant que la reconnaissance institutionnelle suit. On a des éditeurs dans différents journaux qui contrôlent le contenu de ces bandes dessinées, qui le censurent et qui du coup empêchent aussi d'une certaine manière le développement d'une vraie inventivité. Donc on a là un art, certes, mais un art qui est bridé en quelque sorte, hein, même s'il est extrêmement, s'il est extrêmement profitable pour ceux qui s'y adonnent.
This situation changed a little bit after the 1930s with the introduction of a new format that we in the United States call a comic book, even though of course it's not much like a book, it's more like a magazine. And the comic book it emerged in the early 1930s, as you see here, initially just as another form of merchandising. The original concept of the comic book was that this would be a good way to take the comic strips from the newspapers that were popular and reprint them in a magazine format that you could sell, for 10 cents. Okay, so this was just another way to merchandise the popular comic strips. Here we see Mutt and Jeff by Bud Fisher reprinted in a comic book format. So originally this was just another form of licensing, taking this material, leasing it to publishers who would then print it up into a magazine format to sell again. But this format achieved a completely different kind of status when publishers started publishing comic books featuring new characters and new comics. In particular, in 1938, the debut of Action Comics #1, featuring a character, I don't know if you're familiar with this character or not. His name is Superman. He's like a man, but super. Okay. And anyway, this was a huge hit. This was the first original hit of the comic book format, an original character only available in this format. And it was also, of course, the beginning of a new genre of comic storytelling that didn't exist really before, which is the superhero, which was a kind of mix of science fiction and adventure and various other genres. And this was so successful, of course, that it led to the development of other new superheroes for comic book formats. Many of them are characters who we are still familiar with, such as Captain America, Wonder Woman, and Batman. Many more of them are characters who we are no longer familiar with because they've disappeared. They were popular briefly, but now we're not very interested in the Blue Beetle, the Silver Streak, or Doll Man. Okay, but regardless, this was a huge fad beginning in 1938, and it was the first original fad of the comic book format.
Donc voilà, dans cette grande action de merchandising qui accompagne la bande dessinée, va apparaître l'album. En fait, l'album au départ c'est juste un moyen de continuer à faire de l'argent sous une autre forme. On publie les planches qui ont eu le plus de succès dans les journaux, on les rassemble pour en faire donc des albums qui ne sont pas des albums à part entière. Et donc il faut attendre vraiment 38 pour que tout d'un coup quelqu'un ait l'idée de produire un album avec des personnages inédits qu'on n'avait jamais vus dans la presse précédemment. Ce personnage, ça sera Superman, bien sûr, qui va être le premier des super-héros. Et comme cet Action Comics remporte immédiatement un énorme succès, alors on va apparaître toute une série d'autres magazines du même type, Detective Comics, Session Comics, etc. Et toute une série de super-héros dont certains sont encore aujourd'hui très célèbres et d'autres ont complètement disparu, comme le Blue Beetle ou Dollman, etc.
But one of the things that's important to understand, that in America the comic book format is so strongly associated with superheroes for a variety of reasons. However, and the superhero genre established the comic book format. However, the superhero genre was really a fad. It only lasted for a few years. People became tired of superheroes, and by the end of World War II, other genres emerged that actually became more popular than superheroes. And they were reaching out towards a wider audience of young men and young women, increasingly reaching out to an older audience beyond children, sometimes an audience of soldiers returning from World War II who had read comic books while they were stationed in other countries overseas and continued to read them when they came back. And there was a real diversity of genres in American comic books after World War II, a lot of different genres, including romance, crime. Crime comics became a big genre in American comic books after World War II, and horror. Horror became a huge genre in American comic books after World War II.
Oui, vous avez compris, les super-héros finalement passent assez vite à la trappe pour être remplacés par tout un ensemble de nouveaux genres. Donc le genre sentimental avec les briseurs de cœur que vous avez vu précédemment, là, ou l'horreur, les BD policières, etc. etc.
Now, this is where comics started to get into a little trouble again with American culture. Because, the comic strips, they were questioned when they first appeared, but eventually they settled into a place in the culture, in part because they were undeniably successful, but also in part because they existed within the newspaper, which was controlled by editors, and everything seemed like it was part of an official culture. These comic books existed outside of newspaper cultures. They were published by sometimes small publishers who were accountable to no one, who came from lower class origins often, many of them Jewish American and excluded from certain parts of society. And as the comics became more diverse and started to reach out to an older audience and incorporate these genres like crime and horror in particular, they started to attract some negative attention. The most well-known voice in this situation was a Jewish German doctor in America, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham, who worked with disadvantaged children and started to realize that many of them were reading these crime and horror comics. And to him, this was deeply disturbing that children without any parental supervision were reading these crime and horror comics. He began writing articles and contributing to articles that appeared in the national press, Horror in the Nursery. This is by another writer, but Frederick Wortham. We see his name in the very first line of the article. He's quoted throughout the piece. He wrote articles on his own, denouncing the comic books, and in 1954 published his own book, Seduction of the Innocent, The Influence of Comic Books on Today's Youth. Talking about how terrible these comics were, how they were training children to become criminals. And he was the most outspoken voice, but not the only voice. And this was an influential point of view in American culture in the 1950s. And not only do we see Wortham and others writing articles about this thing, there was also a phenomenon of comic book burnings in the 1950s. And parents and teachers and churches and local communities would organize these comic book burnings. They would collect all the comic books from the children and have these public burnings of comic books.